They say the coldest nights are silent, but those who've lived through them know better. They remember the crack of frost beneath their boots, the eerie creak of frozen wood in the dark, the way your breath catches and turns sharp like a blade when the air gets so cold it bites. But in the winter of 1317, in a village cradled between the shadowed moors of northern Yorkshire, silence wasn't just broken, it was shattered. That year, the wind came early. It howled through the bare trees like a chorus of the dead snow, drifted waist-high in hours. Chickens froze where they roosted. A wild fox was found solid as stone outside the bakery. But it wasn't the animals that stirred fear in Hymir. It was the look in the eyes of the villagers, seasoned farmers and fire watchers who, for the first time in years, didn't speak in certainty. No one knew if they'd make it to spring. Aelric stood at the edge of his half-buried cottage, staring into the storm. He had faced 20 winters in these hills, but this one whispered something different. It wasn't just the wind, it was what the wind carried. Rumors, stories, the memory of the frost of 93, when whole hamlets vanished overnight, buried under snow, too heavy to dig through, too deep to survive. But in this house, where smoke twisted up through a slanted chimney and tiny fingers clutched at wool cloaks sewn by candlelight, fear could not live, because Hymir was built on something deeper than stone memory. And memory, in this place, was survival. Inside, the hearth crackled. Not from fresh firewood they were saving the best for the deep freeze, but from smoldering peat in last year's ash. Merit, Elric's wife, held their youngest child to her chest, her arms wrapped in layers of waxed wool. No one spoke of hunger, not yet, but they all felt the first gnaw. This was the beginning of the deep nights. The villagers had a name for this season, not winter, not frost. They called it the White Wait, because that's what it was, a wait for warmth, for light, for anything to prove the darkness wouldn't win this time. And yet, this year, something else stirred in the silence. That night, as snow devoured rooftops and the last light blinked out across the hills, the villagers of Hymir gathered, not in panic but in ritual. They called it the Soul Fire, a tradition older than anyone could remember, passed down through whispered lullabies and cracked leather journals. In the home of the firekeeper always, the warmest house, always, lit first, the entire village would cram shoulder to shoulder. No shoes, no titles, just breath and bone, heat and hope. Elric's house, half dug into the earth like a sleeping animal, was that place this year. Old Nan arrived first, dragging a sack of bark and salt. Then came Hugo the baker, still dusted in flour from the last round of emergency loaves. Even Marta, the spinner, who hadn't left her house in 3 winters, hobbled and wrapped in fox pelts. They came because the soul fire wasn't just a flame. It was a promise that no one would freeze alone. Stories began, not happy ones, not fairy tales. Real stories of the blizzard that took Father Alric's grandfather, of the night wolves came so close to the church that the bells rang without hands. But still, there was laughter. Nervous, low, shared through trembling fingers and cracked lips. Then the children took over. They told tales of snow, witches, and frost giants who hunted those who cried at night. And slowly, something extraordinary happened. The temperature rose, not just in degrees, but in spirit. Outside, the wind still screamed, but inside, the soul fire blazed in a time before thermostats, before down jackets, before electric ovens and sealed windows. These people found a way to outwit the cold, not with technology, but with memory, community, and bone-deep ritual. It wasn't glamorous. It was raw, real, terrifying. But that's where the story truly begins. Because in that house, beneath the frost, something ancient stirred, a knowledge passed through generations, a blueprint for survival. And it wasn't just about homes or hearths. It was about how people lived, moved, slept, ate, and loved when the world outside tried its hardest to erase them. What happens next will change the way you think about winter, history, and the power of human instinct. So stay with us, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us keep these stories alive and gives us the spark to light the next fire. Now, let's test your instincts. Question time. If you lived in a medieval village during the harshest winter, what would be your first move? A. Insulate your home using wattle and daub, straw, and ash. B. Hunt for fresh meat in the forest. Comment your answer below with A or B, and let's see how many of you have the survival sense of a 14th century peasant. Long before the cold swept in, before the first snow crusted over the ridge of Hymir's farthest barn, Elric had already begun preparing his home not for comfort, but for war. A quiet war. A war fought with wind, frost, and silence. But the weapons were not swords or fire, they were dirt, clay, wood, and memory. Hymir's homes did not rise boldly into the sky. They did not reach out with towers or spires like the churches in distant York. Instead, they pressed down into the earth itself. They sank, they nestled, they held their breath and waited. These homes were not built against nature, they were built with her, coaxing warmth from soil, light from stone, and shelter from the elements, with a kind of reverent stubbornness that only the truly desperate or truly wise understand. Elric's house was dug 3 feet into the hillside. To a traveler, it might look like a collapsed barn or a forgotten cellar, but inside, it pulsed with an ancient logic. The earth, cold and constant, wrapped around the walls like an old friend. Beneath the frost line, temperatures stayed steady, warmer than the air above, cooler than the fire below. It wasn't luxury, it was insulation. You didn't have to. Chopped out the walls were alive, in a way. Crafted from layers of twist-wattle woven willow branches, daubed with a mixture of clay, straw, and cow dung. They did more than just stand, they breathed. They flexed and contracted with the cold, letting moisture escape without letting warmth slip out. On stormy nights, when winds howled so loud they seemed to speak, those walls held firm. The scent of earth and smoke clung to them, a perfume of survival. Merritt had once joked that if she ever fell asleep outside in the cold, she wouldn't dream of heaven, she'd dream of her walls. The roof sloped at an exact angle, measured not with rulers but with memory. Too flat, and snow piled heavy until beams snapped like matchsticks. Too steep, and warmth escaped. The villagers knew better. They stacked thatch thick layer after layer of reeds, broom, and heather, and stitched it down with hazel twine and prayer. The thatch didn't just shed snow, it held heat, turning every home into a quiet oven. Windows were small narrow slits, no wider than a loaf of bread. They were placed high to trap the rising warmth, and were often sealed with oiled cloth or woven hay in the worst months. Still, light found its way in. Aelric had a single shard of translucent alabaster, a gift from a wandering mason that he'd set into the eastern wall. On rare, clear mornings, it bathed the house in a soft, golden glow, like fire trapped in stone. Even the doors were designed not to welcome, but to withstand. Low and narrow, they forced each visitor to bow before entering, not in reverence, but in practicality. Heat rose. The shorter the doorway, the less escaped each time it opened. The village itself was laid out in a crescent, backs turned against the biting north winds. No one remembered who had first designed it that way. But as children grew into adults, and adults into memory, the shape remained, each home leaning on the next, like hands around a candle. Inside the house, everything had its place, not for tidiness, but for thermal logic. Beds were built farthest from the drafty door, against the earth-packed rear wall. The hearth, dead center, radiated outward. Above it, a smoke shelf caught the fumes before they choked the lungs, channeling them slowly to the roof's peak, where a simple vent let them slip into the sky. But perhaps the most brilliant invention of all was what no one ever saw in the heart of the wall, behind the woven lattice. Elric had tucked dried moss and crushed flax, replacing it each year, not to plug holes. Not exactly, but to catch warmth like a net. Every bit of retained heat, every exhale, every baked loaf, every story told by firelight was trapped and reflected inward. This was not architecture for beauty. It was not built to impress. It was built to endure. In the world outside, kings built castles to show strength. In Hymir, peasants dug homes to prove wisdom. And in those homes, half-buried, half-forgotten generations lived, died, and passed down secrets in stone, in straw, in silence. Because to survive the coldest nights of the year, you didn't need to rise tall. You needed to dig deep. They called it the soul of the home, but in truth, it was something older than metaphor. In Hymir, the hearth wasn't just where fire lived, it was where the village breathed. Without it, the house was just a shelter, cold, hollow, but with pipe burning. Even Luit became something sacred. Elric's hearth had stood in the center of his family's cottage for generations. It wasn't carved from marble, nor rimmed in iron. It was just stone and ash, shaped by hand in time. But there, in that shallow pit, no wider than a cartwheel, entire seasons were survived. Food was made edible, wet boots were dried, infants warmed, and old men kept alive through nights that could kill with stillness. Every evening, as darkness deepened and the frost grew teeth, Merritt would tend the coals like a ritual, not with grand ceremony, but with quiet precision. She was not just a mother or a wife, she was Hymir's firekeeper, a title passed quietly from elder to chosen, hands not voted, not inherited, but recognized. It was a sacred role, known not by announcements, but by how the embers responded. Under her care, flames behaved. Smoke moved where she told it. Sparks obeyed. Each night before sleep, she'd bank the fire with ash, layering it gently like a mother tucking in a child. In the morning, before the birds even whispered, she would lift the gray crust and breathe life back into it. The fire never truly died, not once, since the first time her grandmother had lit it in that very same place. Some claimed the hearth still held those ancient breaths, warm and waiting. Visitors who entered Elric's home in winter never looked to the rafters or the thatch. Their eyes were drawn to the heart, the flicker, the glow. There was always something cooking, even if it was just a pot of boiled moss or a stone to warm hands. Children learned early that you didn't speak ill or loudly near the hearth, not because it was fragile, but because it was listening. When food was scarce and nights were long, the fire became more than warmth. It became memory. Storytelling by the hearth was not entertainment. It was preservation. It reminded the young of what the old had lived through, and the old of why they'd endured. The hearth heard every birth, every fight, every whisper of grief, and in the silence that followed, it held those truths like a confidant, too loyal to ever speak them aloud. Even the smoke served a purpose. It curled slowly to the rafters, warming the air above and coating the thatch in a protective film that insects hated and rot couldn't breach. It didn't choke. It lingered like a veil, a soft reminder that the house was alive. You didn't rush the smoke. You moved with it, letting it guide you. Twice a year, the village honored the fire, not with banners or music, but with a simple gathering known as the blessing of the hearth. One by one, each household came to Merritt's home, lighting a small torch from her fire to carry back to their own. No words were needed. It was a transfer of life, of continuity, of trust. If her hearth ever went out, they said, winter would come harder the next year, but it never did. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Elric would rise, not from cold, but from memory. He'd sit by the glowing embers and watch them pulse in the dark. He'd remember his father's hands, showing him how to stack kindling with space to breathe. He'd remember the night their first child was born, when the storm raged and the fire almost died, and how Merritt had brought it back with tears on her cheeks and steam on her brow. No, this wasn't just heat. This was history. This was heritage. The hearth was not simply a place in the home. It was the home. It taught patience and care and presence. It demanded humility and rewarded consistency. And through every bitter wind, every aching bone, every prayer whispered to an uncaring sky, the fire answered not with words, but with warmth. And in that warmth, the people of Hymir found not just survival but meaning. There was no rooster crowing at dawn in Hymir during the deep winter months. Dawn, if it could be called that, arrived slowly, timidly, an anemic stretch of light, barely peeling the night from the sky. In the coldest stretch of the year, time didn't pass in hours. It moved in shadows, in warmth, in instinct. Elric's eyes opened not to the sun, but to the breath of cold on his cheek, and the rustle of straw as Merritt quietly slid from the shared bed platform. The fire hadn't gone out. Merritt would never let that happen, but it had dulled to a pulse beneath the ash. Their day began not with light, but with fire. There was no clock on the wall, no bells beyond the distant, muted tones from the abbey, if the wind was right. But the villagers didn't need them. They followed the clock of ice. The frost gauge, just a simple clay pot set outside the door, told them what the sun hadn't yet risen to say. If the water inside had frozen solid with cracks spidering through it, they knew it would be a 2-firewood morning. If it hadn't frozen at all, the day would be long and precious. Time was a language of frost and embers. You, eager to take on new responsibilities, had taken charge of the frost pots that season. He would tiptoe out at first light, cheeks red with cold, and read them like runes. His proud little voice would call back the verdict. Frozen high and shallow. Da, said it'll snow by evening. And it usually did. The villagers did not rise. In a flurry of activity, their day unfurled with deliberation. Every movement weighed against warmth and need. There was a sacred slowness to winter mornings, the kind that felt like ceremony. First came the tending of the hearth. Then, quietly, the dividing of tasks. Wood must be brought in. The chickens checked if they hadn't frozen. Traps near the edge of the woods examined for rabbit or vole. Between 10 and 2 was what they called the golden span. Not because the sun shone brightly, it rarely did, but because it marked the warmest slice of the day. For hours where work was done, quickly and with purpose. Merritt might take wool to the dyeing shed, while Hugo and his apprentice loaded the communal oven with the village's bread. Elric would work to reinforce fences against the heavy snow expected later in the week. No one wasted movement. Even talking was kept minimal outdoors to preserve breath and strength. It was during this narrow window that time felt most like its summer self. Children, wrapped in cloaks and padded boots, ran errands between homes. Smoke rose straight and sure from chimneys. The village had a quiet hum to it, a rhythm, like a song only the people who lived it knew how to sing. After the sun passed its brief arc and began to fall, the village contracted again. Shadows lengthened. Cold returned. Chickens huddled. Dogs whimpered. And one by one, doors closed. But this was not the end of the day. The hours between dusk and sleep were among the most treasured in Hymir. They called it the gathering, a time for twilight councils and shared warmth. Families came together in whichever house was designated for that night's meeting. Fire was centralized. Duties were checked off. Who would take frost watch? Who had spare wood for Marta's family? Who had spotted smoke drifting oddly from the hills beyond the forest? Old Nan, now too frail to walk without help, still spoke with authority during these gatherings. Her voice had grown raspy, but when she spoke, others listened. She had once been the frost warden herself, when her knees still bent without complaint. She knew the rhythms better than any, and it was she who noticed the signs of a hard freeze coming before anyone else. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the day wasn't the work or the warmth, it was the way they slept. Unlike our modern rush to bed and crash into unconsciousness, the people of Hymir followed an ancient rhythm: first sleep and second sleep. They would doze in the early evening for a few hours, rise around midnight, and use that quiet window to tend to small chores, check animals, stoke fires, or speak softly with one another. Some even wandered next door to visit neighbors or trade goods. It was a pocket of calm in the deepest part of night, where the world outside was at its coldest, and the heart of the village beat slow and steady. Then came second sleep, a deeper rest until morning. Warmed now by the fire reawakened, the embers newly fed, the bodies of family nestled close again. Time in Hymir wasn't wasted. It was wielded with care. Every hour was functional, every routine deeply rooted in shared survival. The villagers knew that chaos came for those who didn't respect the clock of ice. In our world, we speak often of time management, of productivity, of calendars full of obligation. But the people of Hymir understood time in its purest form, not as something to conquer, but as something to listen to move with, to honor. Because in winter, time could kill you or it could save you. It all depended on whether you knew how to read it. In Hymir, kitchens were not rooms, they were acts of resistance. They didn't sparkle, they didn't sprawl. They were often nothing more than a corner near the hearth, a few stones set for balance, a blackened iron hook, and a pot that never fully cooled. But from that modest place came warmth, sustenance, and a kind of ancestral science that no one had a name for, only a feel. Merritt's hands moved like memory. In the near dark of early morning, before the children stirred, before Elric emerged from his sleep haze, she'd crouch by the pot and lift its lid with the reverence of a priestess. The smell was always evolving: stewed carrots, maybe, or the marrow from a well-split bone added 3 days prior. Their pottage was a living thing. It had no beginning, no end, just a body of warmth, thick with root vegetables, pulses, grains, and whatever scraps the week had yielded. They didn't call it cooking. It was something deeper: stew-keeping, perhaps. Each villager had their own approach, their own rules. Merritt never stirred clockwise after dark. Hugo the baker added a splash of thick beer each Sunday to sweeten the edge of bitterness. Marta, always practical, dropped in dried nettles for strength when illness crept close. These weren't recipes, they were rituals. Food in winter wasn't just fuel. It was layered meaning. Every mouthful had to stretch. Every calorie counted. The bread Hugo baked, dense and nearly black, wasn't meant to be light or beautiful. It was meant to last, to keep bellies full and minds sharp through frost-laced weeks. His loaves were scored with sigils, passed down from his grandmother, not for design, but as a quiet prayer to the ovens. The communal baking oven stood like a giant stone animal at the village center. Once a week, on the appointed day, families brought their dough, their tins, their pies packed with dried meats or stored apples. They didn't compete, they shared heat. Hugo managed the fire, feeding it with rhythm, knowing precisely how long each stage would last. First, the hardest loaves, then softer dishes. Last, trays of beans or slow-boiled oats that could soak up the oven's last exhale. That day was known unofficially as the round, because the oven's fire served everyone, and no one left empty-handed. Merritt often slipped hot stones from the oven into cloth and tucked them beneath blankets for the children's feet at night. A single oven, a shared fire, a collective warmth. Even on ordinary days, food had its moments of magic. A cracked egg, somehow preserved in ash. A splash of sour milk turned into cheese. A wind-dried strip of meat rehydrated in the stew until it tasted like memory. Every discovery was a victory. Every misstep earned oats. A cracked clay bowl felt like betrayal. Not just to the meal, but to the family. Children learned early to help. Ewan had mastered the art of flipping oatcakes on a hot stone by the hearth. timed by how long it took him to recite the frost prayer. Little Freya, not yet. 5. Delighted in pressing dried herbs between waxed cloth to flavor water or tease out a sore throat. They had no cookbooks, no formal rules, but there was instinct, and it was inherited, not in words, but in muscle and heat. You learned to trust the smell of something long before you learned to trust a recipe. You learned the difference between almost ready and nearly ruined by watching your mother's eyes, not the clock. Preservation was a science all its own. The stone pit behind the house kept roots cool and dark. Jars were sealed with wax, dried leaves, and quiet confidence. Fermented cabbage, aged beer thicker than soup, and pickled onions that bit the tongue. These were not luxuries. They were time, stored and savored. Every piece of food told a story. That bean had been pulled from the garden by candlelight in October. That dried plum was one of the last from Marta's orchard before the frost came early. That strip of pork, salted and smoked, was from the shared pigs slaughtered on St. Martin's Day. Nothing was random. Everything had purpose. In the depth of winter, when the cold curled like a fist around the village, it was the smell of food rising from hearths, steaming through cracks in the walls that reminded people they were still alive, still fed, still together. The cold kitchen of Hymir wasn't a place to impress. It wasn't adorned, but it was wise. It was watchful. It was fiercely, unapologetically practical, and in every ladle drawn, in every crust broken, in every flavor layered, not for luxury, but for life. There was the quiet, defiant fire of instinct. In Hymir, sleep was never careless. It wasn't taken for granted, and it certainly wasn't private. Sleep was a shared ritual, a carefully choreographed response to the cold, shaped by centuries of necessity and passed down like a sacred choreography of breath and warmth. By the time the final embers in the hearth began to dim and the wind whispered through the eaves, Elric and his family had already begun the process, one that resembled more a strategy meeting than a bedtime routine. The bed platform, wide and raised precisely 18 inches off the packed earth floor, was the village's best-kept secret of survival. High enough to avoid the coldest air that clung low to the ground, low enough to still absorb the radiant warmth from livestock resting in the partitioned back room. It was not merely furniture. It was engineering, hidden in simplicity. Merit always lay on the outer edge first. She was the lightest sleeper, the first to rise and tend to the hearth if the coals needed attention. Beside her were the children. Freya curled like a cat, Ewan with his hands always tucked under his cheek. Elric took the far edge, where he could feel the draft from the door and know if something was wrong. Old Nan, when she stayed over, was always placed in the center. Age demanded the warmest spot. They didn't sleep flat. The platform was gently angled, creating a natural lean inward. Over years, the straw and wool bedding had shaped itself to their bodies like snow molded around stones. Their posture was slightly reclined, chests elevated. It was the position of someone at rest but ready, and it made sense. Reduced exposure, better breathing, less shifting, less heat lost. Blankets were heavy and sparse. Most families had one main cover, shared among all. Underneath, they wore their thickest tunics, straw-stuffed boots lined up nearby for the inevitable fire check. Sometimes they added fur or woven cloaks, but more often than not, it was body heat that did the work. Their warmth wasn't wasted. It was harnessed. There were rules to the sleep arrangement. Ewan, young and eager, once asked why he couldn't sleep by the wall. Because the cold presses hardest there, Elric answered without looking up. It wasn't scolding, it was knowledge. Cold crept in like water in darkness. If you didn't plan for it, it took you. But warmth wasn't just about physical placement. It was also about timing. Hymir followed what modern minds might call segmented sleep, though the villagers never named it. The first sleep came with the darkness, a heavy, immediate descent into rest that lasted until midnight or just after. Then, they would wake gently, naturally, and move through the house like sleepwalkers, with purpose. Merritt might check the baby's wrappings. Elric might stir the coals and add a pinch of moss for scent. Sometimes Ewan, wide-eyed and half-dreaming, would whisper questions about the stars. And sometimes when the wind didn't scream and the snow didn't threaten, there would be quiet conversation, soft singing, prayer. This hour, between sleeps, felt almost holy. The coldest part of night, and yet the most alive. Afterward came the second sleep, deeper, more settled. With chores done and bodies warmed again, they'd return to their positions and slip back into dreams. It was during this second sleep that most of the village's hopes wandered through their minds, visions of spring, of green grass, of ovens, full of bread and babies, born in warmth. But warmth, as always, was a responsibility each night. Someone in the village was assigned fire check. It rotated, noted in Father Alaric's wooden ledger, by the door of the council house. If it was your turn, you rose when the frost reached its sharpest. You walked house to house with a lantern and a hook. You knocked, waited, checked that coals were banked properly, that no smoke was trapped, that no one had fallen asleep too far from the center, that no child had slipped toward the edge of a draft. No one resented the duty. They respected it. The memory of a family lost 3 winters ago, caught in a freak storm, their fire gone out, their breaths frozen in the air, remained carved in stone outside the chapel. Even in sleep, Hymir moved as one body. Warmth was not just a comfort, it was a shared task. And in the small hours, when most of the world dreamed in solitude, this village dreamed in unity. Sleep, in that place and time, was a language of love, of strategy, of survival. They slept like snow, fell quietly, layered, close together, each flake soft, but together, unbreakable. No one in Hymir feared the snow. They feared being unprepared for it. Long before the first flake fell, before the last apple was picked, or the final lamb slaughtered for the year, the looms began their quiet work. Wool was gathered, spun, twisted into thread, and handed to the women, mostly women, who sat beneath low beams and flickering firelight, weaving survival into every stitch. Marta's fingers, though bent with age, still moved with the kind of memory that doesn't come from thought, but from blood. She didn't need to look as she spun, or measure as she cut. Her hands knew. Each winter cloak, each stitched mitten, each hood sewn with herbs for scent and protection, they weren't just garments. They were blueprints, passed down and worn threadbare, then remade again. In a village like Hymir, clothing was not about fashion. It was about insulation, about calculation, about time and tension, fiber and fit. The most valuable pieces weren't the thickest, but the smartest. 5 layers, Marta often said, didn't mean much if you wore them wrong. Closest to the skin, the softest wool, sometimes mixed with nettle fibers that had been soaked and softened until they resembled linen. It was itchy at first, but no one complained. It wickeded moisture away from the body, keeping skin dry even in sweat or snow melt. Then came denser wool, brushed thick to trap heat. Outer layers were the harshest, greasy, unwashed, saturated in lanolin. These cloaks and wraps repelled water better than any modern coat. They didn't wash their winter clothes, not fully. To strip the wool of its oils was to strip the body of protection. A clean cloak was a cold cloak. Instead, they brushed, they aired, they hung in smoke and sun, and trusted the bitter scent of mutton and moss to keep the wet away. But there was ingenuity, too. Merritt had learned to stuff the seams of her children's cloaks with dried moss, certain types gathered from the shadowed parts of the wood that stayed dry even in storms. Some of it had antibacterial properties, though they didn't know the term. They just knew it stopped the rashes, the boils, the stench of days spent sweating under snow. In especially harsh weeks, She would press bits of lard and beeswax into the cuffs of sleeves, forming a seal against the wind. Boots were made from old hide, soaked in vinegar, and then stiffened with ash and bone glue. Stuffed with straw, they weren't elegant, but they were warm. Every child learned by age 6 how to twist straw into insoles, tying them with thin twine to change out daily. Cold came quickest through the feet, and quickest through the feet came death. Hoods were sacred, not just caps, but armor, sewn with channels for folding and refolding, depending on the wind's direction. Some were lined with rabbit fur, others simply packed with old wool scraps. But all were crafted with intent to preserve the ears, the nose, the breath. Marta remembered. Still, the winter a storm came so fast, they couldn't reach the barn for 3 days. Her daughter, then barely older than Freya, had wrapped herself in 3 cloaks, and still shivered. So Marta tore a quilt from the sleeping platform and turned it into a vest, sewing barley grains into the hem so it would weigh down and hug the skin. The idea spread. That spring, every family asked her for the same design. Hymir's warmth was not just sewn. It was shared twice each winter. The villagers gathered for spinning bees, not just to work, but to work together. Dozens of hands turning wool, carding, gossiping. As they spun, the body heat rose, and no fire was needed. Songs were sung, jokes told, pieces bartered, boots for mittens, cloaks for baby wraps. It was less about trade and more about trust. One year, Ewan tried to make his own scarf for free. He cut it unevenly, the ends fraying, one side too short. But when she wore it out to help gather firewood, the village praised it as the most beautiful piece of the season. Not because it was perfect, but because it was proof that warmth wasn't just about wool. It was about hands, about care. The people of Hymir didn't bundle themselves in garments to look grand. They bundled themselves in strategy, in legacy, in tenderness disguised as twine. When they stepped into the snow, they did so wrapped not only in layers of fabric but in the quiet brilliance of those who had endured winters before them. And in the warmth of that knowing, no frost could reach the heart. There is a particular kind of warmth that doesn't come from fire. It has a pulse. It breathes. It smells of straw and damp earth and haystack fur. In Hymir, it was the warmth of beasts, and it was every bit as vital as the hearth. When the cold pressed down hardest, when even the embers seemed to flicker with fear, it was the animals who offered their silent, unknowing rescue. The people of Hymir didn't just shelter livestock during the winter. They built their lives around them. Behind nearly every home was a partitioned room, or sometimes even a connected lean-to, where cows, goats, sheep, and the occasional pig shared space with the family. The beasts weren't just guests, they were part of the architecture. Their bodies, dense with warmth and thick with breath, turned frigid rooms into livable spaces. One cow could raise the surrounding temperature by several degrees. 3 cows could mean the difference between sleep and survival. Elric had always taken care in placing the animals before winter set in. Ludwig, his broad-backed ox, with eyes like wet bark, had the prized stall closest to the main wall, not just for convenience, but because his breath and heat reached the sleeping platform more directly. The pigs, less reliable in temperament, but valuable in body heat, were penned slightly farther, their straw refreshed daily with ash to prevent rot. Chickens were kept in boxes high above the ground, where their heat could drift down like mist. This arrangement was no accident. It was the product of generations of careful observation and necessity. Heat rose, walls leaked, wind sought weakness, and so the beasts were placed accordingly, warmest first, largest closest, smallest where their warmth could be trapped. Even their breath played a role. Moist and heavy, it filled the air with an unspoken humidity that softened the brutal dryness of winter. It wasn't comfortable in the modern sense. Nothing about winter in Hymir was, but it kept lungs from cracking, skin from splitting, and fires from consuming wood too fast. The scent pungent earthy row became a kind of comfort. Children like Ewan didn't mind the smell of cowhide or the sharp temps of goat when it meant their toes stayed warm at night. Old Nan, who had lived through more winters than anyone else, once said she slept better when she heard the steady exhale of the animals beyond the wall. Their dreaming keeps the frost away, she whispered, but warmth came at a cost. Beasts had to be fed, watered, cleaned, and it had to be done without opening doors, without letting the hard-earned heat vanish in an instant. Elric had installed feeding chutes, a clever rig of planks and hinges that allowed hay to be dropped in from within the main house. Water was stored in ceramic pots buried deep in ash near the hearth, then carried out only when needed. Waste was handled just as carefully. Layers of straw were piled high, absorbing moisture and slowly composting, creating a second source of heat beneath the animals. Marta's son, once assigned to muck duty, called it the heat beneath the hooves. He wasn't wrong. The ground itself grew warmer with each week. There were disagreements, of course. Once, two families argued over who would host the village's largest bull during the frost season. It was an unspoken truth that the family housing the most animals had the warmest home and the most work. But in a place like Hymir, envy had no place. Survival depended on cooperation. If one home grew cold, another opened its doors. In late January, when the wind was sharpest and even the crows had gone silent, the beasts became more than heat. They became reassurance. Their presence, their breathing, their warmth reminded everyone that life persisted, that not all things yielded to winter. Father Alaric once said that the animals were not just companions or laborers, they are the hum of life, he'd murmured during a twilight council. They keep us from forgetting we are not alone in the cold. No one disputed it, because in Hymir, where winters could strip bark from trees and snap bone like kindling, the difference between freezing and enduring could be found not in magic, but in a cow's breath, a pig's body, a chicken's rustling wing, and in the quiet understanding that every shared breath mattered. The fire warmed your hands, but the beast's warm, living breathing warmed your soul. In the coldest weeks of the year, when frost grew thick enough to still a crow in mid-flight, and even the moon seemed to shrink away from the night, the people of Hymir did something rare, even radical. They leaned closer to each other. Survival in Hymir had never been a private affair. The bitterest winters revealed a truth deeper than snow, deeper than any fire. It was not the hearth that saved them, not the wool or the ox, not the pickled roots or insulated beds. It was each other. Each family had its own fire, but the flame that mattered most burned in the center of the village. It was the communal hearth, maintained in the old council house, where the entire community could gather when cold became threat. Father Alaric was the keeper of that flame, not as a cleric, but as a steward. He didn't preach. He tallied. He remembered. He organized. In his ledgers, he tracked not just firewood rations and frost watch rotations, but kindnesses who shared their loaf, who opened their home, who gave their last kindling to a neighbor whose supply had turned wet with sleet. These were not acts of charity. They were necessities. No one could survive winter alone. Each household earned warmth marks, carved into small wooden tokens kept near the communal bell. A family who helped shovel paths after a snowstorm or repaired a neighbor's thatch received a mark. Those who hoarded or neglected their duties risked losing them. But it wasn't about punishment. It was about remembering that heat, like hope, was a shared resource. And then there were the frost wardens appointed in autumn, rotated by moon cycles. Elric had served once, years ago, and still remembered the weight of the task. He walked the village at dusk, checked chimneys for smoke, doors for warmth leaking through cracks. If an elder lived alone, you knocked. If a child had not been seen all day, you asked. If no answer came, you entered. No locks, no pride, only people. Twice a month, The village held what they called the gathering of breath. No firewood burned for it. Instead, 20, 30 people crowded into the largest home of Van Maritzen relied on nothing but body heat and presence. Stories were shared, plans were made. News was passed, hands clasped, tears sometimes shed. It was the only heat some villagers would feel that week that didn't come from a flame. During the longest freeze in memory, when the wind howled for 5 days straight and the sun barely cast its light beyond the ridgeline, Hymir became one body. Kitchens were opened, bedding was pulled from storage. The community hall became a second home for families who'd lost livestock or suffered illness. Father Alaric moved from house to house each evening, handing out tokens of hope, bundles of dried rosemary, shards of old bread, warm stones from the council hearth. No one went without. Even disputes, which still surfaced like ice cracks over animals, over tools, over firewood gone missing, were settled with compassion. When two boys quarreled over who would carry water to Marta's house, Father Alaric smiled and gave them both a task. One would carry the water, the other would sing her a song. By the time spring finally cracked the frost from the ground, and the first green threads of grass peeked through the melt, the village was leaner, wearier, but intact. Hymir endured because it remembered something. Modern hearts often forget that survival is not just about grit, or strength, or even preparation. It's about proximity. The warmth that truly mattered wasn't just the fire you built for yourself. It was the fire you offered to someone else when your own hands were shaken. It was the knock at the door when the wind blew loudest. It was the bed made wider, the meal stretched thinner. The moment someone said, "Come in, you'll freeze," out there, without thinking twice. One fire might keep a family alive, but it takes a village to keep the soul from freezing. When we first stepped into Hymir, tucked in the folds of northern Yorkshire, wrapped in frost and wind, it may have seemed like just another medieval village, just another backdrop to a time long buried beneath the sediment of history. But as we walked through the doors of Elric's sunken home, as we felt the flicker of Marit's hearth, as we listened to old Nan's stories, saw Ewan's frost checks, and watched Father Alaric mark the passage of winter in wood and ash, we realized this wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of design, devotion, and above all, connection. Hymir didn't survive because its people were stronger, richer, or smarter. They survived because they never tried to do it alone. Every element of their winter life was intentional. The architecture wasn't just built for shelter, was shaped for warmth. Homes carved into the ground, walls woven from branches and clay, thatched roofs sloped with precision, everything layered with moss and time-tested intuition. Their homes were not fortresses, they were vessels. Vessels that held heat, but more than that, held each other. The hearth in the center of each home wasn't merely for cooking. It was a memory keeper, a symbol of continuity that connected generations, linking the present to the past and the living to those they had lost. Marit didn't just stoke a fire. She preserved a lineage of warmth, of survival, through ritual and patience. Around her flame, children learned, elders remembered, and silence was shared without fear. Their days were ruled not by minutes or hours, but by a frost-born rhythm. Mornings that began with clay pots of frozen water, afternoons compressed into precious 4-hour work windows, nights divided into 2 separate sleeps that allowed for reflection, connection, and community. They didn't fight winter, they timed their lives to it. And in doing so, they mastered the art of not just surviving, but thriving within it. Their meals weren't lavish, but they were sacred. Pottage never ended, it only deepened. Bread bore the weight of whole winters in its crust. The oven in the village square wasn't just a tool, it was a gathering place, a source of warmth that radiated beyond heat. Hugo didn't just bake. He made food into fire, and fire into fellowship. And when they slept, they did not scatter into cold corners of quiet homes. They curled inward, shared warmth like currency, positioned their bodies like puzzle pieces of care. They weren't just preserving heat, they were preserving each other. Clothing was not fashion. It was intelligence passed through the loom. Marta's cloaks were woven from knowledge, stuffed with moss, sealed with lanolin and patience. Boots didn't have logos, they had straw, memory, and marrow. Hoods turned with the wind, not to look away from the cold, but to understand it better. And when the fire wasn't enough, when even the hearth's glow seemed too weak, Hymir called upon its oldest allies. Not angels, not saints, but animals. The warmth of Ludwig's breath, the steady pulse of sheep in a backroom stable, the body heat of pigs and chickens transformed into a slow, living engine of survival. The beasts didn't save Hymir, but they joined them in enduring it. What held all of this together was never the strategy alone. It was the spirit behind it. Father Alaric's ledgers, his warmth tokens, his stories recorded not in ink, but in deed. They weren't rules, they were reminders. No one eats until all are fed. No one sleeps warm while another shivers. No one faces winter alone. And that brings us to the heart of what Hymir really is. Not just a place, but a lesson. Elric and Merritt didn't just prepare for the cold. They prepared to meet it together. Their children weren't raised to fear hardship, but to respond to it with resilience and generosity. When the snow fell hardest, the people drew closest. When the wind howled loudest, they sang. And when all seemed lost, someone knocked at someone else's door and said, "Come in, share the fire." This story isn't just about medieval life. It's about something far more modern. How we, today, live with or without each other. In our current world, we have heating systems, thermal clothing, stocked supermarkets, weather forecasts. But do we have Hymir's closeness? Do we still gather by a single flame? Do we share our warmth, emotional, spiritual, literal, with those who need it most? The truth is, many of us live insulated, but isolated. We have fire, but no gathering, comfort, but no connection. The hearth may be burning, but we've stopped inviting others to sit beside it. The people of Hymir would not have understood our loneliness. To them, survival wasn't about the individual. It was about the collective. They didn't hoard warmth. They passed it like bread, like light, like breath. And that is the deepest lesson this village offers us. When the frost comes, and in every life it does, it's not the size of our fire that will keep us safe. It's how many people we've brought to its glow. So take this lesson into your modern world. Be the one who gathers others. Be the one who keeps watch when others sleep. Share your resources, your attention, your time. Build community like its shelter. Tend to your relationships the way Merritt tended her flame, gently, daily, without fail. Because the true danger in winter isn't the cold, it's being cold, alone. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of Hymir's story stayed with you most? Was it the way they built their homes into the land? The two-part sleep? The communal oven? The way they used animals for warmth? Or perhaps their unwavering commitment to each other? Let me know in the comments. Was it A, the architecture of survival, or B, the spirit of shared warmth? Your thoughts aren't just welcome, they're part of this fire. So leave a comment, read what others share, and let's keep this warmth going beyond the screen. And if this story meant something to you, if it sparked something deep and human and hopeful, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life, where history isn't just remembered, but felt. Together, we keep the fire burning.